ready. Oh, she can click. Okay, she's good.
Okay. Can you hear me? So, hello everyone and welcome back. Now I'm going to invite our other panelists, and that is Ms. Alia Salem and Sara Bawany. Alia Salem is the founder and executive director of Facing Abuse and Community Environments FACE, and for the past 17 years is also a co-founder of Action for Palestine, AFP. While on the other hand, Sara Bawany is a licensed clinical social worker and a case management director at FACE. So please go ahead.
Great. Okay. Assalamualaikum. Are we okay to take masks off up here? Okay. Okay, do you want to do the, I know, but you're gonna, oh, yes. Okay. Assalamualaikum. I drove all the way here from California. Okay, I didn't drive. I flew and I went all over the place. So I'm gonna do it one more time. Assalamualaikum. So good, alhamdulillah. My name is Alia Salem. I'm the founder and executive director for FACE, which stands for Facing Abuse in Community Environments. We were started 5 years ago. This May is our 5th anniversary. Alhamdulillah, we're really excited. We're actually surprised we survived this long, to be frank. But we have been through a lot. And one of the biggest things that everybody in this room has been through, that we have also been through, is the pandemic. And so when we saw the theme for this year, we were like, oh my God, we have so much to say, subhanAllah. So we wanted to share with you a few things. It's gonna sound familiar. It's gonna sound familiar to everybody in this room, everybody who is online. I don't know, I suppose that's the camera. Hello, assalamu alaikum. It's gonna sound very common to all of our experiences, especially those of us who work in the community, work for nonprofits, are in leadership positions, etc., and who have had to help hold this community together, especially in ways that deal with mental health, that deal with trauma, and that deal with general, vulnerabilities that exist within our community. So what we're talking about today, within and beyond a global pandemic, and what we've learned. So most of this is not rooted in any sort of academic, strategic analysis. This is the data that we've collected from on the ground. We approach it from a mix of an academic and grassroots positioning. So we do capture data. I'm a big statistics and numbers person. And we also have this grassroots reach to where we go. I've been traveling since December, not only to do investigations, but to meet people and really get a feel on the ground now that we're kind of coming out of Omicron and we have some, safety, feelings of safety at least, maybe the illusion of safety, to go and reach out and meet people where they're at, and also try to pick up some of the slack that the pandemic, kind of piled upon us. So we're going to go ahead and talk about a little bit about what FACE is, who FACE is. This is me and my 2 coworkers. We are full-time staff members. We work in different parts of the country. So Sara is in Texas. Ziya, who is our operations coordinator, she is in Maryland, and I'm in the Bay Area. I'm a native Texan, but as we'll talk about, I moved during the pandemic to be closer to my family. Sara is our director of case management. She's a licensed clinical social worker and certified case manager. And so she oversees and basically keeps us organized, takes on part of the investigations, and makes sure everything is in line the way that it's supposed to be. I do some investigations and everything else like a good executive director. So, as I said, we were started in 2017. We have 7 different disciplines that are listed up here. And the reason why FACE was created, this is just a primer to kind of get you used if you haven't heard of FACE before. 7 disciplines were utilized. I personally am an interdisciplinarian. My background is interdisciplinary studies with communication sociology and religion and culture. And I really enjoy bringing in a lot of disciplines to give holistic perspectives and approaches to complex social problems that we're facing in the Muslim community. And so these different disciplines we've woven together by bringing in subject matter experts and people who are working within the community on these various issues to either be on our board of directors, our volunteers, our advisors, etc. And that's proven to be really successful and really rich for the content that we put out into the community. We are position ourselves as victim-centered and trauma-informed. Victim-centered, we need to clarify, does not mean victim-directed. Those are in this room probably understand the difference between the two. But we position ourselves as victim-centered because it's really important that we take a position that focuses towards the most vulnerable of parties that are in existence when we're dealing with what our organization does, which is filling the gap or helping to bridge the gap of accountability that exists in the Muslim community when it comes to leadership, religious leadership, community leadership, etc. And so we position ourselves as victim-centered, making sure that we're doing it from a trauma-informed lens. Of course, Sara is trauma-informed and she's worked a lot on this particular topic and background, but also, sorry, I didn't know where we were going. But also, I myself have taken trauma-informed classes. I've been certified in various aspects of mental health response, crisis response, etc. And so that is an extremely important aspect of how we do the work, making sure they have access, victims and survivors have access to therapy, they have access to resources, but not just access, we help them to get in contact. Because as many of you know, one of the biggest problems to gaining support for mental health and other resources is actually finding the right solution. And so we're so blessed to have a licensed social worker and therapist who can understand the different dynamics in play and help work through that for the victims we work with. We are survivor and women-led. I am a survivor of childhood sexual assault, as well as domestic violence and sexual assault in general. It sounds like a lot, it is a lot, and we'll talk about what happens when you face a global pandemic as a survivor as well. But we're survivor-led and women-led. We think that's important because 84%, as we'll talk about, of the victims we work with are female, so it's important to have a female grasp and understanding how this affects women as a whole. And then finally, we work in the US and Canada. Now we have colleagues across the world. We have a group that meets once a month called the Face International Collective. If anybody is working on this particular topic of spiritual abuse or accountability for religious and community leaders, I encourage you to reach out to us. There is a little bit of a background check and an onboarding process. We meet once a month. We have currently 8 countries represented, and we talk about these issues, what's happening in our areas, we problem solve, we're support group for each other, and it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to get together. And as of last year, a woman named Lamisa Sokor in South Africa, in Cape Town, started an organization with our help. It's called PEACE, which stands for People Eradicating Abuse in Community Environments. And they follow the FACE model on how to address, investigate, and look into these situations from a victim-centered trauma-informed standpoint. She herself is also a survivor of spiritual abuse and abuse by a religious leader. So moving on, our mission is something that's really important this year in particular, and why we want you to know it is because it's foundational for the Muslim community. It's not just for FACE. It's something that we really want to transition and translate to the Muslim community and those working in community spaces at large. Before this year, our mission said something to the effect of we want to hold religious and community leaders accountable, right? We were going to go in there, we were going to do something, we were going to help these people, and we were going to hold them accountable. That was great. We had a really beautiful niyyah when we were going into it. And we kind of were like, this is probably not possible, but let's see what we got going on. Because nobody's done this before. We're literally the only organization in the world, this is not hyperbole, in the world that's doing a grassroots community-run organization that investigates it without having remuneration or compensation from institutions, that does it on this strategic level. And so when we were going out there and doing this groundbreaking work, thank you, we were doing this groundbreaking work, it was really important for us to understand really what is possible. And so we shifted to this year that our mission is no longer to hold leaders accountable. Communities locally need to do that. What our objective is to engage in a process of social cultural change that pivots away from protecting and centering the institutions and protecting and centering the victims and vulnerable populations instead. And we want to do that very clearly outside of the criminal legal system, because that is its own process. We're here to help deal with things in a broader scale. We're here to help deal with things from a Muslim standpoint and without the harmful exploitative practices that can often happen within the criminal legal system. And so we want to make sure there's a community solution to bridging that gap as well. So we're going to move on to Sara, who's going to talk to us a little bit about investigations. We're going to run through a couple of these slides, and then she's going to get us right into the pieces about the pandemic.
Hi, everybody. So just moving on to the types of abuse we investigate. Physical, sexual, spiritual, and financial abuse are the four main types of abuse that face work to substantiate. Of course, we know as mental health professionals, there are many types of abuse. A lot of these overlap, and a lot of these overlap simultaneously with emotional, psychological abuse, etc. But because these are the ones that we are primarily able to substantiate, those are our four main focus types of abuse. So just some statistics and demographics to show you kind of the impact we've had and the amount of reports that we've received. So we were founded in May 2017, we're coming up on 5 years now. And in that time, we received 161 reports of abuse from the US and Canada and around the world. And that's still being considered a small, very rare organization. At the moment, we currently have 40 open cases. So of those 161, we've published 5 investigative reports. The other 18 are historic transgressions, which I'll talk about in just a second. And even despite that, still we have 40 open cases in the US and Canada. So you see our caseload is very big for a team of 3. So of those 23 reports that I mentioned, 5 are reports that we investigated ourselves and substantiated and compiled reports on. The other 18 are what we call our historic transgressions list, where we have compiled publicly available records of individuals that have harmed or abused positions of power. And this information is already being publicly available for us. And so we just have a place for that on our website so that institutions can make better hiring and firing decisions. Because oftentimes these individuals face legal consequences, etc. But then they got out of, probation, prison, whatever, and right back to being the senior Imam of a masjid, which we feel is not acceptable. So that's why we compiled that. No, keep going, go back. So I want to also just bring your attention to the fact that 30% of the so I'm not going to read through all of the statistics and demographic information, but 30% at least of the victims that we work with who report to us are considered low income or below poverty line. So this shows us that a trend of what kind of individuals are targeted when it comes to these kind of situations. Are the ones that are very vulnerable, specifically financially. And with the pandemic, I think in many ways that has been exaggerated a lot. No, stay there. Okay. So I also want to bring your attention to that graph. The reports filed each year. So 2017, of course, is our accounting year where we were until the first report was published. And so the number of cases we received was very small. And that number jumped exponentially in 2018, was about the same in 2019. And then the pandemic rolled around March 2020 or so. And so we expected that everybody was, traumatized, dealing with their own stuff, basic needs, people losing jobs, family members in the hospital. Like, it was a very, very trying time for the world, for our community. And so we expected, like, you know, maybe things would slow down. We had to go into austerity measures, which we'll talk about in just a second. So we also had to slow down, but the reports did not slow down. In fact, they doubled from the previous year. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And the only reason in 2021 they almost stayed the same as 2020, oh my gosh, is because we had to implement a moratorium, meaning that we were so full and so overwhelmed we could not take any more cases. Even then, the number of reports we received was almost as much as in 2020, hence our 48 cases. So just jumping into, you know, investigating during a pandemic and just some of the impacts that we noticed on ourselves, on the clients that we work with, on providers that we also connect clients with. You know, we're going to talk about mental health implications. So Alia mentioned a little bit that we have a victim support department that works separately from the investigations and attempts to connect the victims and survivors with therapists, chaplains, even spiritual counselors, any practitioners or individuals that can kind of help work them through these issues. Because when we work to investigate what they have gone through, you're dredging up a lot of trauma, you're dredging up a lot of memories, and we want to make sure that they're well supported and that they have the resources to be able to, you know, work through the investigation process to the end. Because it oftentimes is a very long and very difficult process. But one of the things we noticed during the pandemic, which again, we all know, there was a general decreased bandwidth of therapists overall. Therapists were so overwhelmed. There were not very many that, you know, were open to taking clients, and it became harder and harder to find therapists who took a specific insurance who were also able to see the clients that we were referring. We did notice, though, that there was, you know, a general inability for in-person visits, and so telehealth made these visits more accessible. And then there was like a blurring of state boundaries, and so therapists were able to cross those state boundaries and, you know, see clients. And sometimes we clients in like Kansas or Kentucky, and you could find some therapists there, and so we had to go beyond those state lines. And you know, that poses its own difficulties, as we know, but it made it generally accessible. But there was also still that barrier that they couldn't have all of the state therapists, you know, when it comes to referrals and, you know, the emergency support that was needed, or sometimes it was. Ready to hurry up? Okay. Staff mental health, we really struggled. I think, again, that's everybody. We really struggled as a staff. I think Alia can probably talk more about that. And then in general, not only did we get a large number of cases in 2020 and then in 2021, but there was an increase in the complexity of the types of cases that we were receiving. So just very, very complex, very rooted for several years, even generations in our community. And because we were unable to visit in person because we left them travel to those communities, it made it really hard for us to even do our job. So as if we weren't already backed up enough, you know, we also face barriers to completing those investigations. Yeah, so that's what I was just mentioning, is that in-person interviews are vital, and that's something we've noticed. You know, one of our disciplines is journalism, or investigative journalism, and best practice journalism is to really visit a community you're writing about. And again, that became really difficult when we weren't able to do that. You know, we're trying to attribute what was the reason that we got such an influx of the number of reports, because we assumed people were going to be doing, you know, trying to handle their basic needs and just handle their affairs, but instead we just got so many people who were like, we no longer have to go to the masjid, we could not go to the masjid. We ceased to be in that environment that was bringing us so much trauma, and in that time, we could just sit back and reflect on what we had actually been through as victims and what kind of abuse that we were facing from the religious leaders at those masjids. And so that sitting at home and kind of being stuck and not being able to gather at the masjid actually caused people to like reflect and ponder, and even empowered them to come forward and report. And so that caused the influx of reports to face. Yeah.
So one of the important pieces that we wanted to talk about is shifting priorities and bandwidth. And she was talking about mental health, and that of course had a huge impact. I myself, during that time, started realizing without the ability to go, you know, out in person, I'm an extrovert, you're home a lot with your thoughts, and you start wondering why you're doing things the way that you're doing. I went and sought out emergency funding to see a psychiatrist. I find out that I'm a 42-year-old with not only PTSD from the trauma, but I also have undiagnosed childhood ADHD, severe ADHD. And so I'm finding these, new things for myself in the midst of all of this and trying to figure out how to cope with new medication, all that kind of stuff. And so my own priorities and bandwidth shifted. For example, I picked up and moved from my home of 42 years to the Bay Area, California. I'm from Texas. And so we saw a lot of people making big shifts. My priority was to be with my family, et cetera. We saw a lot of people who had different priorities because of the protests that happened and what happened to George Floyd. People were only wanting to focus on positive and uplifting conversations, et cetera. Funding concerns. I'm sure everybody in this room has dealt with the funding concerns. Grant and individuals, their priorities shifted dramatically. Last year alone, we applied for 20 grants, over $1 million. We got one for $13,000. We're in the possibility of shifting to volunteer base because we can't afford to continue paying our staff. That's incredible, especially with the workload that exists. Not to mention doing trauma-based work while worrying about paying our bills, while victims are worried about taking care of their needs. We don't have the victims' resources coming in. Go ahead. And that all is like trying to go really fast through a really big topic. That's something that we have to all focus on, is not only centering ourselves and those that we work with, but also thinking about how this affects our community at large and making sure we're taking the steps to adjust accordingly from a mindful perspective that meets those needs, but also that meets our needs as service providers. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much, Alia, Salem, and Sara Bawany. Now we have Dr. Denise Ziya Berte, who is a PhD and is the Executive Director of Peaceful Families Project. She has over 25 years history serving international victims of trauma, including domestic violence in Latin America, West Africa, and Palestine.
Round of applause, please.
Okay, so there we go. Salam alaikum, everyone. It is so good to be here. And this is kind of a strange work for me because this is where there's an intersection between two of the things that I love most in life. One being my position as Executive Director of Peaceful Families Project. I'm going to talk about that for about 5 minutes. The other is my life as a professor at Al-Najah University in Nablus, Palestine. And this project was a beautiful chance to sort of build those two things together. So Peaceful Families Project, some of you may know, has been around for about 20 years and has also gone through a little bit of a shift in I would say about the past 2 years. Peaceful Families Project is the national voice of representation for Muslim victims of domestic violence at the national level in the United States. We have 20 trainers across the country working with, and I'll talk about our 4 areas of activity and then our 5 areas of interest. The PFP has been around for about 20 years. You heard our amazing and wonderful, one of our founders, Sister Salma, this morning accept her award. We really are here humbly as the people who carry on the legacy of that work. So we are very grateful to be here. Peaceful Families Project, as I mentioned, is really focused on 4 main activities. One of them being training, so training of imams, training of communities, also training of mainstream providers who are working with Muslim victims of domestic violence. The second thing that we do is research and research development. We know that we cannot get to best practice around domestic violence without the representation of domestic violence victims of Muslim faith traditions. We know that the research that we have now in mainstream communities are what really focuses and bases our best practice. and that Muslims have not been represented in those places, which is why we do the work that we do. We also have resource development. Some of you may know some of our books that were written for imams. We have now 6 languages of domestic violence in various different languages. We know from the latest Pew study that Islam is the most diverse religious tradition within the United States. So we work also to bring our meaning and our goals to all of the communities that we represent. We have also what is called affiliated partners, which are some of the groups that we're going to talk about today. Also, some of you may know Manavdi, which is the Muslim Advocate Network Against Domestic Violence, which represents 40 different direct service providers across the country as well, and that is now sponsored under PFP. PFP also is working in expanding a little bit. So while domestic violence is the major part of our work, the way that we look at domestic violence is a little bit different. So we have our general work in domestic violence, working with imams, working with victims, and working with direct service providers. We started a program, inshallah, it will be working on our pilot this month, called Peaceful Futures, which is a youth curriculum and youth voices around domestic violence, healthy relationships, diversity, and tolerance, knowing that domestic violence does not start when you're 22, 23 and get married, that the seeds of domestic violence are in family relationships during the time of adolescence, during the time of understanding and growing into relationships. So we now have a full curriculum of middle school, high school, and university age trainers. We spent last weekend with them, preparing them. And that will be a pilot project for 60 to 100, inshallah, of Muslim youth across the country. We also now have a program called Peaceful Partners, which is for male allies. And the male allies group does 2 things. We have male allies who are working on that real prevention, that male-to-male education around domestic violence. We have, for the males around, we have a Peaceful Partners pledge, which says, I am a Muslim man. I am the leader of my home. I do not use violence and oppression to make that happen. So we ask for folks to go online and to endorse that. We also are working on the first national batterers program for Muslim males. We know that when, unfortunately, perpetrators are arrested, they are sent into classes, they are sent into rehabilitation programs, most of whom are not created for Muslim men and are very easy for them to say, oh, that's not me, that's those people. So we are very excited about our work within that area. We are also going to be working on a program called Peaceful Partings, which looks at divorce and co-parenting. We know that the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence is when they are ready to separate, divorce, and move forward. That is the time when we have the highest levels of severe violence and homicide. So Peaceful Partings, which is our gift, alhamdulillah, from our faith tradition, we are told that we are to peacefully part, there is no haram in that, there is no shame in that, that is in fact our job as believers. So we have work on peaceful parting and co-parenting. And then we have what is called Peaceful Future, Peaceful World, which is a little bit of the data that I'm going to talk to you now. So this data was collected last summer. I was able to spend the summer back in Nablus. So I am currently a professor. At Najah University in Nablus, Palestine has the only Masters of Clinical Psychology program in the West Bank and Gaza. We are now graduating about 30 students a year. We have been in existence for 7 years. Sadly, as one of the creators and the only doctoral level clinical psychologist attached to the program, I am not able to be there. I was in fact removed by the occupying forces. That's another story for another day. And we'll talk a little bit about, some of you may know about the new legislation removing educators from the country. I was removed twice, and unfortunately now we have severe difficulties with new legislation around us being able to return. So I teach and do clinical work via the internet and my students that are there. But last summer we were there working on this collaborative program between Peaceful Families and the university. So,
Okay, you just click.
perfect.
Right.
Okay. So what is the model that we're talking about? And I want to go back to one of the things that Peaceful Families does is to say, we are working on domestic violence. We are eliminating domestic violence, not by ignoring the fact that we are Muslim, but going back to our deen, by going back to our roots, by going to what it means to be a Muslim. And among his signs is this, that he created for you mates among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them. And he has put love and mercy between you. Verily, in that, there are signs for those who reflect. This is our gift. This is the Islamic model of cohabitation, of marriage, of family. Yep. See if we can. Sorry.
It's a weird map.
Oh, okay.
So you just have to scroll in.
Okay, there. So I want to talk about the actual roots of Islam, because somehow in the transverse of culture and other cultures looking at Islam, the narrative has changed in a way that doesn't make any sense. From its inception, Islam was a faith tradition that established basic and equal human rights for all people, males and females, and was clear in assigning equal status to men and women. You are made of the same soul, not a rib like in Christianity, no story of original sin because Eve took apples. We were told from the beginning that we were equal members of the same soul. Islam had as its core activities the protection of women, children, orphans, and widows, the most vulnerable of people in society. If you remember, some of those early stories of saving young women from being buried alive were what made the activities of Islam. The Quran and the Hadith clearly forbid verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse in multiple texts over and over again. And yet somehow there is a belief in the world, not only the Western world, and I'll forgive me the Western, Eastern, we can talk about colonized versus less colonized, colonizers. There's a million ways to describe this. But there is this belief in the colonizing world that Islam is about oppressing women. And somehow we drank the Kool-Aid. We began to believe this ourselves. That as Muslims, we are a little bit ashamed of saying, I am for the equal rights of women, and also I am Muslim. So what I want us to remember is that modern legal systems have had a very short history, unlike Islam, less than 100 years of protecting any women's rights, and that the United States, to this day, has yet to ratify the United Nations Declaration of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. To this day, has not been ratified. And yet, when we talk about the protection of women's rights, especially in the home, many Muslim communities and Muslim majority countries define this as a Western mandate. And you can see this in international politics, right? You get money if you don't get sanctions, if you respect women's rights per the definition of a country that has yet to ratify the UN Declaration of Equal Rights for Women. Equally, Western entities, which usually includes NGOs within our countries, and unfortunately, in the Palestinian context, a lot of what we do for mental health comes under mandates of the UN, comes under the mandates of outside NGOs who work within our lands because of the way that occupation has happened and the way that education has been attacked. So equally, Western entities such as NGOs have focused on women's rights and programming as a litmus test for the democratization or even a criterion for foreign aid. Some concerns and questions arise as to how much a state government can interfere with the activities in the home, especially when there are multicultural and religious groups, multiple cultures and religious groups within that country. So let's talk about what those governance models look like and who actually falls under these categories, right? So there is a model of governance called communalization, which says the state is secular. It is not religious, and it will explicitly avoid making judgment on religious practices. So one of the places that I've lived and worked is Liberia, and that is what they say. Christians, you make your decisions about polygamy, about marriage. Muslims, you do the same. India, in the past, it should not be under this now, but in the past was more like this. We will not legislate around things that are religious because we have too many religions within our country's purview. We have nationalization, and this is the recognition that there are religious mandates in law, divorce, child protection, abortion, but they are sort of loosely defined by cultural interpretation. So we pretend we are not religious, but there is definitely cultural religious values within the laws, and that they are, as we've seen in these past few years politically, these are the things that become sort of problematic as we change administrations and we look at who has the decision to make these, or who has the right to make these decisions. This includes the US, Europe, Palestine. So we are in the same group, by the way. And then we have theocracies, and that is where the state openly says that it is the enforcer of religious law per the interpretation of the ruling group. That's Iran, Pakistan, Thailand. Now, what I want you to remember is Sharia, which is this idea of Islamically based law, also is not global. So each country's definition of what that looks like is also different, not so distinct from these other governance models. So how do we as cultures and governments regulate families and violence? So there is something called social benefit. What are the rights and benefits under the relationships of marriage, under the relationships of parenting, under the relationships of extended family? How does that what is the benefit and the cost for an individual within those relationships? We have a legal space which talks about family law, criminal law, so is child abuse a family law issue or a criminal law issue, civil law, and religious law. We have the enforcement. So who makes these decisions and who takes that legal perspective and does something about it? Is that police? Is that religious leaders? Is that families themselves? And then we have civil remedies, which means when there is a problem, what happens to those people? And those are things like shelters, hotlines, family intervention, case management. Now, what we know is the systems that we have now have been very much based on forgive me, white, middle class, Christian set of values and set of limitations, because those folks within their secular way of looking at things may not have the same power that we have to use religion, to use extended families, to use other really specific remedies that are available in the Muslim world. So in Palestine right now, let me go back real quick, we have something called personal status laws. Personal status says what is the right of the individual. Because Palestine is not an independent nation in many ways, the Palestinian personal rights laws are based on Jordanian law that has been in place since 1976. It determines, for example, that the age of marriage currently 16 for males, 15 for females, but allows an exemption from a Sharia council, which unfortunately now is covering 33% of all marriages. We also know that family protection, meaning that the ideal of marriage first, or that the protection of the family unit, is something that should be taken into consideration in cases of divorce and child custody, which many times is used against victims of domestic violence, and determines that in marriage, each religious group shall make its own determination. So for Christians in the West Bank, they have a very difficult time. Divorce is still illegal unless they get an interception from the Pope. It is much easier in Palestine as a Muslim to get a divorce than as a Christian. And then, of course, we do have the Samaritans, which are a pre-Jewish group, which live in Palestine, but are regulated under Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian law. We do have penal codes around around domestic violence and family life. Unfortunately, they do not do things like define incest. It does not determine between consent and compliance, and that if you are a woman who is declaring or going for a charge of sexual violation, you have to have a male family member with you. Again, the idea is that is for protection. It does not always work in that way. It really is a stumbling block for many reports. There is no legal protection from marital rape. So this is the previous law. There are no charges of violation of a minor if the individual is unaware of the minor's age, which means I don't ask, I don't know, I can't be charged. There's a penalty for sodomy. There are fines, but not jail time. And abortion is allowed in cases of rape, but there's no structure. There's no system to be able to utilize that. So in 2020, the Women Lawyers Association, along with the judicial lawyers and judges, pulled together what was called the Family Protection Act of 2020. So this was a Palestinian-based initiative. In February of 2020, the Ministry of Social Development, along with the Palestinian Lawyers Union, put forth a Family Protection Act, which included reducing mandates for the protection of family in cases of divorce, that all ministries were required to uphold lack of discrimination against women and could not invoke outdated Sharia judgments, meaning in labor laws, in everything, that women would be treated equally, that there would be special protections established for women with physical and mental health disabilities, that there would be increased ability to charge on intrafamilial sexual assault. So the idea of incest, and that it protected women's salaries as their own property in marriage and divorce. So this was a major, very positive step by the Palestinian legislator to put forth this act. It did not come from any kind of outside influence or force. Unfortunately, because again, we have believed that this is not a Muslim issue, the outcry from the Palestinian community was sort of unbelievable. There was fear of changes in social mores and social structure. People accused the law of bringing more colonization to the Palestinian people because these were Western ideals that were now going to be put in legislation, that there was a dictate for international NGOs, that the only reason that we were doing this was because that we wanted money from the West, or we wanted peace with the NGOs, that was creating conflict between an already marginalized population, so that the last thing that you need under occupation is men and women fighting against each other and not focusing on the battle against occupation, that it reduced family autonomy, what we could do with our own children, and that there was fear of having family-related charge be used for political purposes, right? So we know that when we have political leaders who are charismatic and who are able to bring together people, that would be another place where they could be charged with family-based crimes and take them out of the picture politically. For me, this was a beautiful chance to pull together what I knew from Peaceful Families, because the most amazing thing about our curriculum is that it reminds us that these are Islamic issues, first and foremost, that we as Muslims are against human rights violations of all kinds within ourselves, within our families, and within our nations. So that there is this beautiful way of looking at domestic violence as all of our struggle. What we did, and I did forget to say, and I don't know how I missed this, but I do want to reiterate that the biggest risk for women under occupation is occupation, and continues to be. So no matter what we do about domestic violence, the biggest risk of women in Palestine is the occupation. So what we did is to take the Peaceful World curriculum and present it to 3 different groups in Nablus, in Palestine, from all over the West Bank, but through the university. So we worked with mental health providers, and we had mental health providers from 7 different NGOs, from some of the municipalities themselves, and then from the university. We also did a group of lawyers, especially the lawyers who are part of the protected domestic violence units, and we also did judges. They were each given an 8-hour entire training that talked about domestic violence in general, domestic violence as an Islamic issue. We talked about Islamic resolution within domestic violence, apart from legal kinds of questions. And we talked about the mental health impact to victims, to families, to the community, and to children. The data that you're going to see was very specific to the mental health and social service providers, because with the legal teams, we also did a second day training around forensic psychology and how psychology can be used to help to investigate and to support all kinds of issues of oppression, including occupation, but also within family-based violence. There was both international and national staff, so we did have a group of internationals. Mostly they were French from Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And then we had a very wide, so we had male, female, we had a wide range of ages, a wide range of occupations as well. So pre-test, post-test change, and this is to tell you, this was an 8-hour workshop, right? We're talking about people who have lived in the West Bank their entire lives, who are almost all exclusively Muslim. In 8 hours, we were able to, and those of you who know the statistical part, have a statistical change in there. We looked at knowledge, attitude, and behavior or potential behavior at the 0.01 level. So that very small intervention, 8 hours, made all of the difference. And it made the difference in the face of, there were no differences by gender, by age, by residence, and that means people who are living in villages, people who are living in cities, and people who are living in internally displaced camps. Gender or degree, meaning what their specialty was. We had social workers, we had mental health people, we had MDs, and we had public health people in that room. So nothing else made a difference. There was a significant change in understanding and nothing else made a difference. So I'm going to skip over their comments. You can see those, and I'm going to go right to recommendations and observations. The biggest difficulty we had in that room during those days were the international workers. The international workers were offended by our use of religion. They were uncomfortable with talking about Islam as a positive, powerful force. And they continued to question when we talked about alternative ways of managing domestic violence. The other thing that happened is we talked in that room about some major, very costly misfires where we had Western kinds of interventions. So one of the things that had happened about 4 years ago, I want to say, there was a huge grant by USAID, our not so favorite friends, who came in and spent over $1 million training doctors to recognize and support and report domestic violence. Unfortunately, we do not have a place to report domestic violence to. So it was $1 million of having doctors get really nice lunches and sort of do something that we were pretty sure they already knew how to do, to no end, because we have no infrastructure to then do anything with that data. The other thing is there was another international NGO who opened 4 shelters. Now, again, our situation in Palestine is that people are not leaving. Their homeland is their village. It is their land. It is their parents' land. They are not likely to leave that because of a marital situation to go to another place and live. And unfortunately, again, very, very expensive, beautiful shelters, which are now all being used for other kinds of things. So we know that best practice here does not equal best practice there. All of our participants, except for the international folks, were so excited to be able to use the power of the Quran, the power of Hadith, to be able to say, and this is always my good thing, like, not me, just the messenger, right? You don't like the message, go to Allah, you know, like, I don't know what else to tell you. So it's a beautiful chance for people to have that power. The other thing is it really increases ownership, which is to say, we don't need the United States, certainly, who has not yet ratified the UN Declaration for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We don't need Canada. We don't need Western nations to tell us what has always been our priority, and that we have pride and we have power within that knowledge. And I have no time. So I will pass the mic over to our amazing colleague, Tahani, who is the coordinator of research and resource development at PFP, who is going to talk to you about another PFP work. Those of you who are interested, please check our website, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and there is some information as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berte. And now we have Ms. Tahani Chaudhry. She is the Research and Resource Development Coordinator at Peaceful Families Project. And her research explores religious help seeking from survivors of domestic violence, and particularly the positive and negative impacts of religious leaders. So please have a big round of applause for her. I just use this.
Hello. Can you all hear me all right? I have lots of difficulty projecting, and there are a lot of y'all in the back of the room, so let me know if you can't hear me at any point. Okay. So yeah, I think having Denise's presentation right before mine was a great transition because, again, I work with Peaceful Families Project, and one of the major things that we've been doing,
Do you need me to move?
okay. One of the major things that we've been doing in the last 20 years is training leaders in the community. So we are one of the organizations that has been doing Imam trainings for one of the longest times in the United States. So today what I will be talking to you all about is how we shifted some of those trainings into a virtual format for COVID and just really evaluating the efficacy of these trainings. So just to go over what I'm hoping to cover today, and I will try to keep on time as much as I can, but I really just want to give a background of what is the literature out there that already exists, talk a little bit about, well, what does the PFP Imam training look like? What are the pieces that we cover? And then really jump into the evaluation that we conducted this past year during a virtual national Imam training. And we'll talk through the findings and really what does this mean for the Muslim community overall and where we go next. Okay, so really just to back it way up, I know we've been talking a lot about violence, but what is domestic violence? So starting off with the definition, at PFP, we describe it as a pattern of behavior in which one person in an intimate relationship is exerting power and control over another person in the relationship. This can look like a lot of different things, as my previous presenters have talked about. So it could be physical, it could be emotional, psychological, financial, sexual violence. All of these different types of violence can be covered under this domain of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So one of the really important things for us to know is, well, what does domestic violence look like in the American Muslim community? There is not a lot of research on this. Peaceful Families Project is one of the first organizations to do research in this area. So we have information from a national survey of US Muslims from 2011 in which Peaceful Families collaborated with Project Sakina. And we found that 31% of American Muslims were reporting experiencing violence in an intimate relationship. A third of our community is experiencing this. So this is no small issue. This is actually pretty consistent with the larger data of just the US population at large. So the Muslim community really does reflect the larger US population. When you expand that from intimate relationships to just family violence in general, so thinking about violence from parents, from older siblings, younger siblings, children, anyone in the family unit, that number goes up to 53%. Half of our community is experiencing violence in their homes. So this is a really important issue for us to talk about. It became even more important for us to talk about it during the time of COVID. So there has been a lot of research recently talking about, well, what has domestic violence looked like during a pandemic, where everyone is stuck in a home? We talked a lot about this in the previous presentation as well, where violence isn't ending just because we're all sitting at home. what happens when the home is the center of the violence? So there are studies that are showing there have been a strong increase in domestic violence incidents across the world, but particularly in the United States. And when you consider that piece of social isolation that came with the COVID pandemic, people are literally trapped within their homes. They are cut off from their friends and their families. Survivors had a limited ability to leave the home, to leave the people who are perpetrating this abuse. And we also have to consider that social isolation is actually one of the tactics of abuse in domestic violence that are really commonly used. So the pandemic made that tactic even more common for a lot of survivors. The other thing is that during the COVID pandemic, resources became so much more limited. So things along the lines as shelters, hotlines, even mosques within our own communities were shut down. Survivors often didn't have a place to go. So considering the importance of domestic violence at large, but also particularly within the Muslim community, well, what is the role of imams in this issue? What is the role of imams in domestic violence in the Muslim community? And that's really what I want to focus on today. So just covering the literature, there's not a lot on imams, so I'm also drawing a lot from religious communities from other, drawing a lot from other religious community leaders as well. But particularly a study from Abu Ras and colleagues in 2006 showed that a study of 22 mosques in New York City found that about 96% of the participants perceived the imam as a counselor. So 74% of them went to the imam for counseling related to safety issues. So our community is going to the imam for these very, very important reasons. Alia and colleagues in 2005 found that after spiritual concerns, marital concerns were one of the most commonly common problems that people sought help from imams from. That happens for a lot of reasons. Imams are not just these high leaders in our community, but they're accessible people. These are the people who are doing our nikah. They're the people who know us and our partners. They may be community members. They may be family friends. They know us so well. So a lot of people are going to them for their relationship concerns. There's a lot of varied findings on, well, how often is this happening? There's a lot of research showing that anywhere from 7 to 50% of people are seeking help from imams or other religious leaders for domestic violence. So this is not uncommon. Did this stop working? Hello? Okay, I'll try to project. But then we think about, okay, well, we see the frequency of this, but what is happening when people are going to imams or other religious leaders for help? What is the impact of this source of help? One study found that about 79% of those who confided in religious leaders found it to be helpful.
You can go.
Okay, and so that's great, you know, a majority of people are finding it helpful, great. Well, what happens to the other 20%? Other 20%. There's a lot of qualitative literature showing that there's a really varied impact of imams and religious leaders on survivors of intimate partner violence. Thank you. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. I also want to just give a caveat that there's a lot of limitations to this research. There's very limited research on the Muslim community, which is why I'm so excited to see everyone here in this panel, because this work is being done and it needs to be done. But also there's a very limited definition of help seeking in the literature. So there's this idea that you go, you talk to the imam, you have this one-on-one conversation, he gives you advice, or the religious leader gives you advice, and you move on. Help seeking can look like so many different things. A lot of times survivors of intimate partner violence may not have access to the imam directly. They may go to the wife of the imam. They may listen to sermons from the imam to really get messages about intimate partner violence or messages about relationship. They may be getting messages communicated to them in so many different ways outside of that direct one-on-one conversation. So the literature is really limited in understanding all those different platforms, especially in the time of social media, where during COVID, a lot of imams and religious leaders were communicating with their congregants through social media because that in-person interaction just dropped. Oh. Oh, there you go. Okay. So talking about the variable impact, I'm not so bad at technology. Okay. There is a lot of literature highlighting the negative impact of religious leaders on survivors of intimate partner violence. So oftentimes there's a lot of unhelpful or even harmful advice or responses given to survivors, such as advice to be patient, just sit back, inshallah it'll get better, Allah will make it better, just pray, and tolerate the abuse. A lot of times people are told to accept the abuse as a part of their fate. This was your qismat, this is what Allah has written for you, so accept it and you will be rewarded. There's a lot of research showing that there's a lack of domestic violence training in imams and just religious leaders across the board to really respond to survivors in a trauma-informed manner. So we talked earlier about how trauma-informed care is so important. Survivor-centered care is so important, and this is something that religious leaders are not being trained in right now. Also, there's a lot of research documenting that survivors are often blamed for the abuse. What did you do to make your partner angry? What did you do that made this situation occur? Now, that doesn't mean that it's only a negative impact. There's a lot of potential for imams to play a role in this context. So the research also highlights really positive impacts, like imams and religious leaders can really increase the self-efficacy of survivors. So make them feel more confident and more able to do things like find a job or leave the abusive relationship or feel just confident in their capabilities to handle that situation. They can provide knowledge and offer community resources. Who is the best person to know what are the resources available in the Muslim community? Likely your religious leader, your imam. There's a study that came out in 2021 that showed that most imams believe domestic violence is haram. That is a great place to start. We really need to start at this point that Islam does not say domestic violence is okay, but actually physical, emotional, verbal abuse, all of these different forms of abuse are very explicitly stated as haram in our religion. The other ways that religious leaders can really play a role is by building that community support, by building the awareness. Even before the survivor is coming to you for help, what are you doing in your community to spread awareness? And also to use Islamic knowledge to support and validate survivors. It's very important, as Denise was talking about earlier, to bring it back to our religion, because our religion is one of the best ways that we know how to enact these values and principles. So I really want to quickly just talk through this model of help seeking. The one important thing I want to just highlight in this is that help seeking is not a single experience. It is a whole process. So Liang et al. In 2005 created this model where, well, the first step of seeking help is knowing you need help. It's identifying the problem. Once you identify the problem, then you decide, oh, am I going to seek help or not? And there's a lot of reasons why someone might decide not to seek help. And then you go and you actively seek the help. When your impact is so variable, when religious leaders are having such a variable impact in the people who are coming to them for help, what are the chances that people are going to want to go to them? What are the chances people are going to continue seeking help or continue trying to get out of this really difficult situation? So this model really highlights all the important influences in this whole process. And I think religious institutions and religious leaders are a really important part of both the individual, interpersonal, and social cultural context that survivors are living through. There you go. So in the current study, I'm going to be talking about a virtual national imam training that was led by Peaceful Families Project. We had 8 imams and chaplains from around the United States. For the data I'm presenting today, we have 5 participants because these are the ones who had pre and post data. I'm not sure if you all know this, but imams are very busy people, so they tend to come late and they tend to leave early. So that's why we were left with 5 participants. So this was a 2-day virtual training, and we had a mixed methods kind of methodology here. So where we asked quantitative and qualitative questions. So we'll walk through those. But just to give you all an understanding of what is the PFP imam training, what do we do? And I think it's really important to know what we do to understand whether it's effective or not. So this was a 2-day virtual training, and the interesting thing about this model is that we lead it with 1 imam or religious scholar and 1 mental health professional or counselor. So really we're bringing the best of 2 worlds together because we need to see that collaboration. We need to see that intersection more. And the types of topics or concepts that we really cover in this 2-day training are things like understanding the dynamics of abuse. What is domestic violence? Because that's where we really need to start. Then defining the boundaries and the roles of the imam and the chaplain. Where do you come in? What is your responsibility in this situation? We view a documentary about Muslim or about domestic violence in the Muslim community, which is something that Peaceful Families put out in early 2000s, a long time ago, called Garments for One Another, but it's an amazing documentary. It's very important to have these resources that are very Muslim and Islam specific. We do case studies so that all this information that you are learning, you're also applying to situations in practice. And then the imam or religious scholar leads a session on theological issues. So what is the perspective of DV from an Islamic framework? We always want to bring it back to that Islamic framework. The counselor leads a session on the intersection of DV, mental health, and spirituality, because the amazing talk earlier, spiritual abuse is a real thing, and we need to make sure that we are talking about that. And then we talk about counseling considerations, so like things like reflective listening, empathy. We talk about risk assessment, so how to ensure the safety of the individuals in your community, and ethical and professional issues, and really strategizing, well, how do we then apply this in the community? So the four main areas that we measured, and this is something that Denise talked about as well in her talk, is we talk about knowledge. So what do you know about DV? We talk about attitude. So what are you believing about DV? Then we talk about intention, because it's not just enough to know and believe, it's also really important to act. But since this is right after the training, we can't necessarily see, well, are they actually behaving in this way? So we ask for, is there intention to behave in this way? And then finally, we measure for satisfaction. So in the quantitative measures, there really wasn't a significant change from pre and post test. But if you look at these graphs, you can probably see that most of these participants were starting off really high. And the reason why is because this is a very self-selective sample. So the people who are willing to come to a domestic violence training and are willing to seek out more knowledge about this are likely the people who are starting off with a high level of knowledge, a high level of motivation and willingness to engage in these types of conversations, and they're not stigmatizing it. But the piece that I do want to highlight is some of those qualitative responses. So the changes that you see tend to be in those nuanced discussions. So we asked a question about, well, if a community member disclosed potential violence in their relationship to you, what would you do? And I took out these two participants because I think they're particularly reflective of that nuance. So participant MS at the pre-test said, well, I don't know, and that's why I'm taking this program. So very understandable response. But in the post-test said, I would ensure that they're heard and safe before helping them with this situation. So really touching back to those risk assessment pieces, but also those counseling pieces of how do we provide empathy? How do we provide validation? Participant HS kind of came in with more thoughts and more plans about how they would approach the situation. So I would bring it to the attention of the imam. I would get them services. I would, figure out what are other ways that I can do this. So a very problem-solving approach. Here are all the things that I'm going to do. In post-test, it really shifted to I would believe them. I would validate them. I would hear their experience, and I would ask them how I can help. I would thank them for trusting me with this information. So that shift is so empowering, really. So giving the choice, placing the trust in the survivor themselves as how can I help you, rather than immediately jumping to all these problem-solving solutions. And that really comes from that counseling perspective. Overall, in terms of satisfaction, all of the participants either agreed or strongly agreed that the training met their expectations and met their needs, the concepts were well presented. But I also, again, want to highlight those qualitative quotes. What did you find to be most helpful in this program? Balancing that academic and spiritual perspectives and sources. So that the intersection of those two worlds is really important in the way that we are talking about domestic violence in our communities. What is the key messages you take away from this workshop? It's that it's a lot of work. This is a lot of work that needs to be done in this community. And yet there's a community of Muslims who are working on this issue, so I don't feel alone. So while simultaneously we're emphasizing, hey, this is a really serious and important topic we need to talk about, we're also telling them you're not alone. This burden isn't entirely on you. We're here to support you. In terms of constructive feedback, and this is particularly relevant to virtual trainings, one participant said it was difficult sitting in front of a computer all day, which I think is something we can all resonate with. I definitely resonate with it as a doctoral student. So in terms of talking about limitations, this was a very small sample size, only 5 participants. So we just did not have the variance that we needed to see any differences. It was a very self-selective sample, and inshallah, we're trying to do more long-term follow-up so that we can really get back to those behaviors. So what is it looking like in practice? And where we want to go next is really recruit from a wider sample. We need those imams who aren't talking about domestic violence. We need those imams who are stigmatizing domestic violence and potentially presenting harmful information. So the work of PFP really continues in terms of getting that wider access. Well, Bumi's going next, so she'll talk about this anyways. I'll make her talk about it. But this is also contact information for Peaceful Families Project if you want to follow us or need resources from us. We are happy to help.
So if we could have our presenters come up, we've got lots of questions for you, but I'm going to actually go back to a slide. So you've heard Sister Salma speak this morning at the awards lecture. You've heard from Peaceful Families Project, 2 different presentations from that organization. I want to let you know that in collaboration with Peaceful Families Project, we need that slide.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry. We are doing a research study to look at American Muslims' experiences, beliefs, and perceptions of domestic violence. Anybody who is Muslim over the age of 18 and lives in the United States of America can take this survey. So there's a, we're trying to get it back up. This will also be posted in the app. Please take it. There's a QR code. I'll also make the link available. We are looking and really wanting you all to take this survey. It's going to be useful for us and identifies ways in which we can intervene, prevent, and I think something so important that Alia, you mentioned, it's like about funding. We don't have to, it's hard to get funding, and our organization is doing this really great work, often volunteer-based or underfunded, and so if we really want to increase the funding and supports, we have to be able to show that this is necessary and this is what we're doing is working. So please consider that. That being said, I'm going to jump to questions. There were quite a few, and I really want to thank our presenters. I'm going to reflect on just really quickly 2 questions that were posed. Alia, you asked the questions, what happens when you face a global pandemic as a survivor as well? Tahani, you said, what happens when the home is the center of violence? I think these are very, very critical questions that we have to grapple with as a community. And I think the presentations really helped us sit and wrestle with that. So I'm going to ask questions for the first presenter. I'm actually going to do jump around. I think we have questions for the first and the third. I think there's one for Dr. So I'll do one for each and then come back around.
Just let the audience.
Oh, sorry. And let me move so the audience can see, our virtual audience can see our presenters. So this first question is for Fayez. Do you think a history of trauma better position you, or does it make it harder for you, I think, to do this work?
That is a great question. Oh, sorry.
That's a wonderful question. It's both. So I think it has granted me personally a lot of compassion, but also like how would I want to be treated? But not everybody's the same, but it kind of gives you that sort of gentleness or at least trepidation, because you know what it feels like to be triggered, you know what it feels like to be hurt, you know what it feels like to be overlooked, you know all of those things. And so you have a more gentleness about you and how you approach it in most things. Although for anybody who is a survivor, they know that sometimes it can get too much, and you can have the pendulum swing so far the other direction, and that's where the negatives come into play. It is you have to turn away from it for a little while. You have to get some distance. You have to try to self-care, and I don't mean like massages and face masks. Like that's wonderful. Okay, that is self-care. I totally want massage and face masks. I mean, like, you have to stop and let your brain rest for a minute. You have to go on regular vacations and get away from it and not be 24/7 being exposed to traumatic situations. Even myself, and I've been doing this work, we were at a religion and sexual abuse conference in Southern California. And 3 times over the weekend, and it doesn't happen to me frequently. 3 different times I was triggered to the point where I had to get up and walk out because I started having flashbacks. I started, having those limiting thoughts. I was nauseated. It was, something that really disrupted my day, and so I had to, be really mindful of that because there were people talking that just they were talking about such important religion and such foods, and they had no concept on how to talk about it in
Just do full screen.
way. And so even myself as a professional have had to go through that. But I would say between the two, overwhelmingly, it has been an incredible benefit. And the benefits far outweigh the negatives, because even in the negatives, there is a benefit of getting it out. One of the biggest things about doing this work is that I had to confront the abuse. It wasn't until I started doing this work that I stood in front of an audience and said I'm a survivor of child sexual assault. And then I'm okay with saying that. It wasn't until this that I'm like, yes, I've been raped. Yes, I was abused for 11 years in a marriage with a person. So, and not feel like I'm some, pariah that exists. And it's because, it just is what it is. And so I don't have that sort of reservation anymore because I'm starting to deal with my own myself.
Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Denise. The question says, you mentioned programming to address female victims of domestic violence and male perpetrators/batterers recovery. Do you have any programs for male victims of domestic violence? And if so, how are interventions considering the stigma associated with such cases? Jazakallah khair.
Okay, I can start with that for that as well. And all of the work that we do, so first of all, I want to be clear that Peaceful Families does not do direct services. We do the part that supports direct services. We are at national tables, we are doing curriculum, we are doing training. So none of our programs are specifically for victims themselves. We are working with providers and other kinds of folks. Of course, we acknowledge that there are male victims. I hope I didn't say it. I tried to use the word victim. We know that there are both male victims and female victims. I do, however, want to talk about what domestic violence is. So we also know that those numbers are about 85 to 90% female to male. And that is not coincidence. And that's not because males are bad. That's because domestic violence comes from a system of power and control. It comes from a place where economics are under your control. It comes from a place where marital contracts are under your control. And overwhelmingly, both here in the United States and in many of our Muslim majority countries, those systems are managed by males. So by definition, males have more power, which makes it easier for them to use power and control against a victim. Simply. If women are in situations where there are more power, so these are situations where we see new immigrant victims a lot of times who will marry to get immigration status or within an immigration difference, situations where women and their families have more economic resources than the person that they marry, then we begin to see those same kinds of power relationships develop. But because of the way that our communities exist, and that's both here in the United States and in our countries of origin, that men have more power, then it's more likely that they're going to abuse power.
So we have time for one more question, and I'll pose questions that were asked to our last presenter. This is 3, but I think they're all very straightforward. The first is, are there incentives to taking the Imam's training? Is it eligible for CE credits? And is it a certification-based course? And I'll also send it down to the card so that you can answer all those questions.
Are there incentives to taking training? So Peaceful Families rely on funding from grants, from donations from the But the piece here is that we do have scholarships, we do have ways of funding imams to come and pursue this training if they're not able to. Majority of imams who are coming to our training are being funded by their community, by their institution, because this is so important for each and every one of our Muslim communities. Is for us to invest in our imams. The rest of us, psychologists, counselors, doctors, everyone has these continuing education credits. We need to ensure that our imams and religious leaders are being held to a similar standard. They're being held accountable for that. So thinking about incentives, the communities themselves are offering or sending imams for these trainings, or PFP provides scholarships. The curriculum as of now is not eligible for CE credits, but I don't think there is a CE credit system for religious leaders. It's not a infrastructure that's in place yet. So one of the things that was on my future direction slide that we had to skip over was that I think it's really important for us to develop that, because again, as I just said, we need to hold our imams to a similar standard that we're holding counselors to, because again, 90% of the Muslim community is going to the religious leader, is going to the imam as a counselor. So we need to ensure that we have that clear. Is it a certification-based course? As of now,
They do get a certificate, but it is not attached to an educational requirement. So I think part of our difficulty, and we've talked about this, is that there isn't a requirement for CEUs. There isn't a requirement for yearly training on, professional boundaries, on sexual abuse, on all of those kinds of things that we as mental health professionals, as teachers, as in many other professions have. So that is one thing that we ask you as a community, is to really begin to talk about with our imam and chaplain training organizations, that this is something that we want to see in our community.
And we are seeing a lot of interest in these trainings from training centers like the Harvard Theological Seminary, places that are training chaplains. This is a huge need in those spaces as well. So we just need to start building that infrastructure. So it is a work in progress.
I want to thank our speakers for the conversations, the lessons that we have learned. You all touched on some very important things for our community, and I hope that this conversation doesn't end here, continue. We do have to wrap up, unfortunately. We're bleeding into the next session. The next session starts at 3:15. But if you could give our presenters one last round of applause. And of course, if you